The mysterious splash. The full moon hung like a bright silver coin in the dark sky. Mike Wilson sat alone in his small fishing boat, his fishing rod forgotten beside him. At 40 years old, with messy brown hair and tired eyes, he wasn't expecting anything special that night. Just another quiet evening on Lake Morrison, like hundreds before. But this night would change his life forever. It started with the lights. Strange, colorful lights dancing across the clouds. Mike rubbed his eyes, thinking he was seeing things. Red, blue, and purple streaks painted the sky like silent fireworks. In his 20 years of night fishing, he had never seen anything like it. What in the world? He whispered, standing up in his boat for a better look. The lights grew brighter, moving in ways that no aircraft could move. They zigzagged across the sky, leaving trails of sparkling color behind them. Then came the sound, a high-pitched whine that made Mike's teeth hurt. It grew louder and louder until he had to cover his ears. The lights above became so bright that the whole lake lit up like daytime. Boom! A massive explosion of light filled the sky. Mike's boat rocked violently as something huge crashed into the lake about 50 feet away. Water sprayed everywhere, soaking him completely. Holy cow! Mike grabbed the sides of his boat to steady himself. Waves from the impact rocked his small vessel back and forth. As the water settled, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Splashing, desperate splashing, and sounds that were almost like screaming, but not quite human. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. Every scary movie he'd ever watched told him to start his motor and get out of there fast. But there was something about those sounds. Whatever was in the water needed help. He grabbed his flashlight with shaking hands and pointed it toward the splashing. What he saw made him drop the light. In the water was a girl, but not any normal girl. Her skin was a pale blue color that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Strange markings that looked like glowing tattoos covered her arms. Her hair was silver, not gray like old people's hair, but truly silver, like liquid metal flowing in the water. She was struggling to stay afloat, her movements becoming weaker by the second. Her eyes met Mike's, and they were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Like swirling galaxies of stars. Hold on. Mike didn't stop to think. He grabbed his life preserver and threw it toward her, but she didn't seem to understand what it was for. She was sinking. No choice then, Mike muttered. He kicked off his boots and jumped into the cold water. The shock of it nearly took his breath away, but he forced himself to swim toward her. As he got closer, he could see she was tangled in something that looked like seaweed, but it glowed with a faint purple light. Whatever it was pulling her down. Mike reached her just as she went under. He dove down, opening his eyes in the dark water. The girl's glowing markings provided just enough light to see. He grabbed her around the waist, surprised at how light she felt, and kicked hard toward the surface. They broke through together, the girl gasping for air. Up close, Mike could see that what he thought were tattoos were actually raised patterns on her skin, like beautiful scales that caught the moonlight. "I've got you," he said, even though he wasn't sure she could understand. "Just hold on." He started swimming back to his boat, pulling her with him. She didn't fight or struggle, but held onto him tightly. Her skin felt cool to the touch, like smooth marble. Just as they reached the boat, the girl suddenly stiffened in his arms. Mike looked down at her face and nearly let go in shock. Her eyes, which had been dark and starry moments before, were now glowing bright red. Not just the iris or pupil, but her entire eyes blazed like hot coals. Her grip on his arm tightened painfully, and far off in the distance, Mike heard the sound of sirens approaching. The night was just beginning. First contact. Mike's arms burned as he pulled the mysterious girl into his fishing boat. The sirens were getting closer, their wailing echoing across the lake. The girl's eyes still glowed that frightening red, but now he could see something else in them, pure terror. She suddenly grabbed his wrist. Her touch sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm, and images flashed through his mind. Massive ships with weapons, soldiers in black armor, and creatures that looked like walking shadows. Mike stumbled backward, his head spinning from the visions. They're coming after you, aren't they? He asked, rubbing his temples. The alien girl nodded. She touched her chest and made a musical sound that could have been her name. It sounded like wind chimes in a breeze. Lyra. Lyra, Mike repeated. I'm Mike. He pointed to himself. She tried to say his name, but it came out like Mike. Despite everything, he couldn't help but smile. Then they both jumped as a spotlight swept across the lake. Black helicopters appeared over the trees, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. But these weren't normal helicopters. They made no sound at all. The only noise was a low humming that made Mike's teeth vibrate. Lyra's markings began to pulse with a faint blue light. She pointed urgently toward the shore, away from the approaching helicopters. Then she made a gesture like running and hiding. Mike understood. My cabin's that way. But first, he grabbed his old canvas tarp and threw it over her. Just in time, a spotlight swept over his boat. Mike pretended to be fixing his fishing nets, trying to look as normal as possible. His heart was beating so hard he was sure they could hear it from above. The spotlight lingered for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it moved on. Mike started his boat's motor and headed for shore, moving at a casual pace, even though every instinct screamed at him to go faster. Lyra stayed perfectly still under the tarp. As they neared his dock, Mike saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 black SUVs were parked on the dirt road leading to his cabin. Men in dark suits were getting out, carrying strange-looking devices that pulsed with red light. But they weren't looking toward the lake yet. They were focused on the woods in the opposite direction. Mike cut the motor and let the boat drift behind a cluster of reeds. He touched Lyra's shoulder through the tarp and whispered, "We can't go to my cabin. But I know somewhere better." He started the motor again, turning the boat south toward the old abandoned watermill. Almost nobody knew about the hidden dock behind it. He'd discovered it years ago while exploring. Lyra peeked out from under the tarp. Her eyes were normal again, swirling with stars. She pointed at the water and made a rippling motion with her hands. Before Mike could ask what she meant, the lake's surface began to stir. The thick fog rose from the water, spreading rapidly across the lake. Within minutes, they were completely hidden from view. Mike stared at her in amazement. "Did you do that?" Lyra smiled for the first time. She touched a drop of water on the boat's edge, and it floated up, dancing in the air like a tiny star. The sound of engines roared overhead. More helicopters. But thanks to Lyra's fog, they were invisible. Mike steered carefully through the mist, grateful that he knew these waters by heart. They reached the hidden dock just as a new sound filled the air. A deep, thrumming pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lyra grabbed Mike's arm again, her markings flashing rapidly. New images filled his mind. Massive ships breaking through the clouds, warriors with glowing weapons, and something else, something that made Lyra's fear spike so sharply that Mike felt it too. The hunters had arrived. And as Mike helped Lyra out of the boat, her feet barely touching the old wooden dock, he realized something that should have terrified him, but instead filled him with determination. He was now harboring a fugitive, not just from Earth, but from the stars themselves. The real question was, what were they hunting her for? Just then, Lyra's markings began to glow brighter than ever, and she pointed urgently at the sky. Through gaps in the fog, Mike could see new lights appearing. Harsh, blood-red spotlights sweeping methodically across the lake. The hunt was on. The chase begins. The old water mill creaked in the night wind. Mike and Lyra crouched in its shadowy upper floor, watching the red searchlights sweep back and forth across the lake. The fog Lyra had created was starting to thin. Suddenly, Lyra's markings flickered with a warning pulse. She pressed her hand against the wooden wall, and her markings glowed brighter. To Mike's amazement, he could see the light traveling through the wood grain like electricity through wires, spreading out in all directions. She was creating some kind of sensor network through the wood itself. Her eyes widened in alarm. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed in different directions. Mike understood. 3 groups of hunters were closing in. But Lyra wasn't done. She touched Mike's forehead, sharing more images. The hunters weren't just aliens. They were living shadows that could melt into any darkness. Even worse, they could possess any shadow they touched, using it to track their prey. As if to prove this, the shadow of an old chair suddenly stretched across the floor, moving against the moonlight. It rose up like smoke, forming into a humanoid shape with glowing red eyes. Mike grabbed a rusty wrench from the floor and swung it through the shadow creature. It dispersed like mist, but quickly began reforming. Lyra's markings pulsed rapidly. She touched a puddle of water on the floor, and it rose up in a spiral. The water began to glow with the same blue light as her markings. When she flung it at the shadow, it screamed, a sound like breaking glass, and disappeared completely. "They're afraid of your glowing water," Mike whispered. Lyra nodded. She touched her chest, then drew a circle in the air with glowing water drops, then made a crushing motion. Mike pieced it together. She had some kind of vital energy that she could infuse into water, turning it into a weapon against the shadows. More shadows were seeping in through the cracks in the walls. Lyra couldn't fight them all. She grabbed Mike's hand and pulled him toward a trap door in the floor. But when they opened it, they found only darkness below, and darkness was now their enemy. Mike had an idea. He pulled out his phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, creating a safe path through the shadows. They climbed down quickly into the mill's lower level, where the old water wheel turned slowly in the current. But they had a new problem. The water wheel was making a strange humming sound, and its shadow was growing larger, darker. The entire mechanism was being possessed by a hunter. The wooden beams groaned as the wheel began to turn faster and faster. The shadow of its spokes stretched across the floor like grasping fingers, trying to trap them. Lyra's markings suddenly changed color, from blue to a bright silver. She raised her hands, and all the water around the wheel froze instantly. The shadow creature screeched as it was trapped in the ice. But the effort cost her. Lyra stumbled, her markings dimming. Mike caught her before she fell. That's when he noticed something terrifying. Where her feet touched the ground, small patches of shadow were starting to crawl up her legs. The hunters weren't just trying to catch her. They were trying to possess her. Mike didn't think twice. He scooped her up in his arms and ran toward the back of the mill, where he knew there was an old drainage tunnel. It would be dark in there, but his foam still had power. As long as they had light, they had a chance. Behind them, the frozen water wheel shattered. The combined shadows of all the broken pieces rose up to form something massive. A shadow monster bigger than anything they'd seen yet. But as Mike ran into the tunnel with Lyra, she pressed something into his hand. It was a small crystal that glowed with the same blue light as her markings. She touched it, and then touched his chest. Immediately, Mike felt energy surge through him. The crystal's light grew brighter, and when he splashed through a puddle, the water began to glow just like when Lyra used her powers. She had shared her ability with him. Now they had a fighting chance. But as they heard the howls of shadow creatures echoing through the tunnel, Mike realized something else. This gift might have made him a target too. And the hunters were getting closer. Hidden truth. Water dripped steadily in the dark tunnel as Mike and Lyra hurried forward, guided by the blue glow of their crystals. The shadow creatures' howls echoed behind them, but seemed more distant now. The crystal Mike wore had started to change his perception. He could now see faint blue trails in the air where water droplets had fallen, like glowing breadcrumbs. Lyra suddenly stopped, pressing her hand against the tunnel wall. Her markings pulsed in a pattern Mike hadn't seen before. Instead of just glowing, they now moved across her skin like flowing rivers. She turned to him with urgent eyes and shared a new vision. This time, Mike saw a magnificent underwater city on an alien world. Crystal spires rose through the depths, their surfaces dancing with the same kind of markings Lyra had. He saw her there, wearing elaborate robes and a crown made of living water that flowed endlessly around her head. She wasn't just any refugee, she was their princess. But then the vision darkened. Shadow creatures poured into the city like black ink through water. They weren't just hunting her. They wanted to use her as a key. Her powers, combined with their shadow abilities, could open doorways between all worlds, allowing them to spread everywhere. The vision shifted again. Mike saw Lyra's people fighting back with weapons made of living water. But the shadows had a terrible advantage. They could possess anyone who had even a drop of darkness in their heart. Soon, half the city was turned against itself. Lyra pulled her hand away, tears like tiny glowing pearls rolling down her cheeks. A deep rumble shook the tunnel. The crystal around Mike's neck pulsed in warning. He raised it higher, its light revealing something strange. The water drops in the air were starting to move upward, defying gravity. "They're doing something to the tunnel," Mike whispered. Lyra's eyes widened in recognition. She quickly pressed her hands together, then pulled them apart to create a sphere of glowing water between them. Inside the sphere, Mike could see tiny shadows swimming like black fish, growing larger. They weren't just being chased anymore, they were being surrounded. The hunters were in every drop of water now, slowly gathering their forces. But Lyra had one more surprise. She touched Mike's crystal, then touched his eyes. Suddenly, his vision changed completely. He could see the molecular structure of water all around them. Every drop connected to every other drop in an endless network. More importantly, he could see how Lyra's power worked. She wasn't just controlling water, she was programming it like a computer, changing its basic properties. Mike looked at his own hands in amazement. The crystal had changed him. Thin, glowing lines like Lyra's markings had started appearing on his skin, though much fainter. He wasn't just borrowing her power anymore. He was becoming something new. Lyra smiled despite their danger, touching his markings with gentle recognition. Then she showed him one more vision. Her people called themselves the HFY, and what she'd given him wasn't just power, it was citizenship. He was becoming one of them. The tunnel shook again, more violently this time. Shadows were seeping through every crack, but now they were different, more solid, more mechanized. The hunters were evolving, learning to combine their shadow matter with human technology they'd absorbed. A massive shape emerged from the darkness ahead. A hunter had possessed an entire water treatment pump, turning it into a grotesque machine-shadow hybrid. Its gears and pipes writhed like tentacles, dripping with dark water. But Mike wasn't afraid anymore. He understood now why Lyra had chosen to share her power with him. The hunters could possess the darkness in people's hearts, but they couldn't touch the light. By making him an HFY, she'd given him protection and a way to fight back. Mike raised his crystal, feeling the power flow through his new markings. Lyra raised her hands beside him, her own markings blazing. Together, they began to reprogram the water around them, turning every drop into a tiny star. The hunter machine roared, charging forward on legs made of twisted pipes and shadows. But now Mike and Lyra had a plan. The real battle for Earth's water, and all its shadows, was about to begin. And in the depths of the tunnel, two sets of markings glowed like constellations in the dark, one ancient and one new, both ready to fight for everything they held dear. Escape plan. The hunter machine's pipes twisted through the air like serpents, but Mike and Lyra were ready. Their combined power turned the tunnel's dripping water into strings of light that cut through shadow-infected metal. The machine screamed, a sound of both grinding gears and otherworldly pain. But victory was short-lived. The severed pieces of pipe began to transform, each becoming a smaller shadow machine hybrid. Soon they faced a swarm of mechanical spiders made of darkness and twisted metal. Lyra's markings pulsed in a complex pattern. Through their growing connection, Mike understood. She was teaching him something new. The HFY didn't just control water, They could change its state in impossible ways. Mike watched in amazement as Lyra demonstrated. She touched a water droplet, and it became something between liquid and solid, a flowing crystal that stayed in whatever shape she moved it into. Then she changed another droplet into something between liquid and gas, a heavy mist that moved like syrup through the air. Water doesn't have to follow Earth's rules, Mike realized aloud. Together, they began crafting defenses. Mike created barriers of crystal water that the shadow spiders couldn't phase through. Lyra formed floating globes of heavy mist that absorbed and trapped shadows like filters. But the hunters were learning too. The remaining spiders clustered together, forming a massive shadow machine centipede. Its segments were made of industrial fans, pumps, and pipes it had absorbed from the tunnel's infrastructure. Worse, it was using the fans to blow away their mist defenses. That's when Mike's new markings began to burn with inspiration. He remembered how Lyra had shown him water's molecular structure. What if they didn't just change water's state, but changed its fundamental properties? He grabbed Lyra's hand, sharing his idea through their connected powers. Her eyes widened with excitement. It was dangerous, something even her people rarely attempted, but it might work. They pressed their crystals together, combining their power. Around them, water molecules began to rearrange themselves, forming new structures that couldn't exist in nature. The water was becoming something else entirely, a new form of matter that was both water and light. The shadow centipede charged, but when it hit their transformed water, something incredible happened. The light water didn't just block the shadows. It began transforming them. Light spread through the creature's dark mass like infection, turning shadows into pure energy. But the process was unstable. The converted shadow energy was building up, making the tunnel walls crack with strain. They needed to contain it somehow. Lyra suddenly clutched her side in pain. Using so much power was draining her. Her markings were flickering, and worse, small patches of shadow were starting to creep up her arms. The hunters were trying to possess her through her moment of weakness. Mike didn't hesitate. He pressed his crystal to her chest, over her heart. His still-developing powers flowed into her, not as strong as hers, but pure and untainted. The shadow patches retreated. Then Lyra showed him one final trick. She wasn't just a princess. She was her people's lead scientist. Every marking on her body was actually a formula, a piece of the most complex water programming language ever created. Together, they began writing new formulas in light water, their markings synchronizing as they worked. They were creating something never seen before, a program that could convert shadow energy into pure water. The shadow centipede thrashed in confusion as its body began dissolving, transforming into crystal-clear pools. But some of the shadow essence survived, seeping into the tunnel walls. As it disappeared, it left behind a threatening message written in rust. The darkness between stars is infinite. We are endless, and now we know where to find you. Lyra sagged with exhaustion, her markings dim. The battle was won, but the hunters would return stronger. They needed to find a safe place to recover and plan. Mike looked at his new markings, now glowing with complex formulas of his own. He wasn't just an honorary Aquari anymore. He was becoming something entirely new, a bridge between two worlds. "I know somewhere we can go," he said, remembering an old cave system he'd explored in his youth. "But first, we need to make sure they can't track us." Lyra nodded weakly. She touched the walls where the shadow message was written, her markings flickering with determination. They had discovered entirely new forms of water and matter today. Tomorrow, they would need to learn how to hide themselves from the very darkness between stars. The hunt wasn't over. It was evolving into something bigger than either of them had imagined. The choice. Deep in the limestone cave system, Mike and Lyra had created a sanctuary. Glowing streams of programmed water flowed along the walls in complex patterns, creating a shield that shadow essence couldn't penetrate. Mike's markings had spread further, now covering his arms entirely, each line containing formulas he was slowly learning to read. But something was wrong. Lyra's markings were changing color, shifting from blue to a concerning purple. She showed Mike a vision. Her body wasn't just generating water programming power anymore. It was producing pure quantum algorithms, the building blocks of reality itself. The hunters had known this would happen. Every attempt they made to possess her had actually been changing her, preparing her body for transformation. They didn't just want to use her as a key between worlds. They wanted to turn her into a living quantum computer that could rewrite the laws of existence. A shadow tendril suddenly snaked through a crack in their defenses. But before they could react, something unexpected happened. Mike's newly evolved markings resonated with the shadow, and instead of fighting it, he could read it like a message. The hunters were offering a deal. Through the shadow link, they showed Mike visions of power beyond imagination. They weren't evil, they claimed. They were the universe's immune system, preventing any one species from becoming too powerful. The HFY's water programming could eventually evolve to control all matter. They had to be stopped. If Mike helped them capture Lyra, they would spare Earth and grant him mastery over all shadows. He could become a Hunter Prime, a being of incredible power. They showed him how Shadow Essence could supercharge his developing abilities, turning his water programming into dark matter programming. Lyra watched anxiously as Mike received the vision. His markings had started to flicker between blue and black as the hunter's offer tempted him. She couldn't interfere. This was his choice to make. But then Mike noticed something in the shadow link that the hunters hadn't meant to show. When he saw Lyra's underwater city in their memories, he spotted crucial details they'd hidden before. The HFY weren't planning to control all matter. They were trying to heal it. The universe was sick, infected with entropy itself. The HFY's water programming wasn't about water at all. It was about restoring harmony to broken systems. Each formula in their markings was part of a grand equation that could reverse the heat death of the universe. The hunters weren't the immune system. They were the virus, spreading chaos to prevent the cure. Mike's markings blazed with brilliant blue light as he made his choice. He grabbed Lyra's hand, and together they did something unprecedented. They began programming the shadows themselves. The shadow link shuddered as Mike fed his own code through it, using the hunter's network against them. Lyra added her power, and their combined programming began transforming Shadow Essence into a new kind of matter, twilight water, a substance that existed in perfect balance between light and dark. The cave filled with floating drops of twilight water, each one containing swirling patterns of day and night. The hunters tried to possess it, but found themselves trapped instead, caught in an endless loop between states of being. But their victory was interrupted by a thunderous crack. The cave's ceiling began to split open as something massive descended from above. Through the growing gap, they could see a vast shadow ship blocking out the stars. The Hunter Prime had arrived personally. Lyra's quantum transformation was accelerating. Her entire body was becoming translucent, codes and formulas swirling visibly through her form. She was becoming pure living mathematics, a gateway to either universal salvation or destruction. Mike looked at his own markings, now filled with twilight water formulas he created. He wasn't just a bridge between worlds anymore. He was becoming a bridge between fundamental forces of the universe itself. The Hunter Prime's ship landed with reality-shaking force. As its doors began to open, Mike and Lyra stood together, their powers combined in ways neither HFY nor Hunter had ever imagined possible. The final battle wouldn't be for control of shadows or water or even worlds. It would be for the very language of existence itself. And in the cave entrance, twilight water continued to swirl, showing glimpses of countless possible futures, all depending on what would happen in the next few moments. Final stand. The Hunter Prime emerged from its ship like a tear in reality itself, a being of pure void wrapped in armor made of compressed darkness. Each step it took turned the cave floor into black glass. Its voice resonated not through air, but through the quantum field itself, making reality shiver. The equation must not be completed, it declared. Order is death. Chaos is growth. Lyra's transformation had reached its peak. Her body was now a living constellation of mathematical formulas, each marking a window into fundamental reality. Through their connection, Mike could see what she truly was, not just a princess or scientist, but the final variable in the universe's greatest equation. The Hunter Prime raised its void sword, ready to end the HFY's grand solution. But Mike had one last discovery to share. While reading the Shadow Link, he'd learned something the hunters had never realized. Chaos and order weren't enemies. They were two parts of the same code. Mike's twilight water formulas began to glow with new purpose. Each drop contained both shadow and light, proving that opposites could coexist. He reached for Lyra's quantum-transformed hand, and their powers merged in an entirely new way. The cave exploded with impossible colors as every drop of water, every shadow, and every particle of dust became part of their combined equation. Mike's human perspective united with Lyra's HFY knowledge to see what neither race had seen before. The universe wasn't dying of entropy or suffering from too much order. It was trying to evolve. The Hunter Prime attacked, its void sword cutting swaths of nothingness through reality. But where it cut, Mike and Lyra's new formula flowed into the gaps, transforming them into something astonishing. Probability crystals, physical manifestations of quantum potential. These crystals began growing rapidly, each facet showing a different possible universe. Through them, Mike could see every choice, every outcome, every way this battle could end. More importantly, he could see how to code them. Lyra's quantum body resonated with the crystals, and together they began the final programming sequence. It wasn't about destroying shadows or preserving light. It was about teaching them to dance together. The Hunter Prime realized too late what they were doing. It tried to summon its ultimate weapon, entropy itself, the heat death of the universe given form. The cave began to age millions of years in seconds. But this was exactly what they had prepared for. Mike's twilight water merged with Lyra's quantum mathematics, creating a new kind of programming language, one that could write instructions into time itself. As the entropy wave approached, they didn't fight it. They reprogrammed it. Reality buckled as their code executed. The Hunter Prime's entropy wave transformed, becoming a bridge between endings and beginnings. Through it, they could all see the truth. The universe wasn't dying. It was in a chrysalis, preparing to transform into something greater. The Hunter Prime's armor began to crack, leaking pure possibility instead of darkness. It reached out one last time, not to attack, but to share its own revelation. Through their combined powers, shadow, light, and twilight all became one thing, the source code of existence itself. In that moment of understanding, everything changed. The Hunter Prime's form dissolved into billions of shadow motes, each one now carrying the new program. Like a viral update, it spread through the shadow network, transforming every hunter across space and time. Lyra's quantum body began to stabilize, her markings now containing the complete equation. Not an ending, but a new beginning. The HFY hadn't been trying to save the universe. They'd been trying to help it grow up. Mike's twilight formulas had become something even more incredible, an interface between the physical and quantum worlds. He wasn't just a bridge between species anymore. He was a translator helping the universe understand itself. The cave, now studded with probability crystals and flowing with reprogrammed time, had become a nexus point for reality's next great leap forward. As the new code spread, shadows and light began working together everywhere, creating art instead of entropy. Lyra turned to Mike, her quantum form solidifying enough to smile. She shared one final vision. Across the cosmos, other beings like them were discovering the same truth, all working together to help existence evolve. They weren't heroes saving the universe. They were midwives helping it transform. The Hunter Prime's ship, now transformed into a garden of living mathematics, lifted off to spread the new code to other shadow fleets. The war wasn't ending. It was becoming a collaboration. As dawn broke over the lake where their journey had begun, Mike and Lyra stood together, their markings now writing new stories in the fabric of space-time itself. He was still human. She was still a query, but they had become something else too. Proof that the universe's greatest power wasn't chaos or order, but love across all boundaries. And in the water below them, shadows and light danced together, practicing their new steps in the endless dance of existence.